delving into the rhetorical analysis task. Now, one thing that I find challenging is that oftentimes students will say that an author uses ethos or uses pathos or uses logos without fully explaining how an author does that. This is something that I want to delve into today. I want to look a little bit at the article Backpacks versus Briefcases by Laura Bolin Carroll in order to sort of think about other ways that we can look at rhetorical analysis. Now, we've already looked at the rhetorical triangle, so we've already looked at ethos, pathos, logos, and we've looked at soapstone, or you've looked at it in that other video that I had you watch. So you've got your speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, subject, and tone. The important thing here is to realize not only that an author is appealing to ethos, but that an author is establishing his or her credibility as an expert in order to use this sort of ethos appeal. So we're going to get into it today. One thing that I want to sort of start with is the idea that, think for a moment about this morning when you got up, or this afternoon, whenever. How did you decide what you were going to wear today? Right? Chances are you thought about what you needed to do with the day, or the weather outside, or whatnot. Likely the biggest sort of influence on what we choose to wear is going to be based on what we need to do for the day and what situations we'll be in. So I might dress one way if I have a job interview or a meeting with my boss, and I might dress another way if, hey, I just have to run down to the corner store and nobody but my neighbor is going to see me and I don't care what they think, right? So chances are if you gave more than a couple, 3 minutes of thought to the clothing that you would wear today, it was probably for some reason, or maybe you're just very fashion conscious. So what I want to be thinking about is how, much like the way we choose to dress ourselves in order to fit into a certain situation or scenario, we do the same thing with rhetoric. We dress our argument depending on the context in which it's going to be presenting itself, right? And who the audience is. So, you can think about at the beginning of the article, Bolin Carroll talks about, on your first day of class, how you perceive the instructor. Now, it's interesting because in an online class, it's likely that your perception of me is less based on physical characteristics and more based on my sort of online persona. But in a real face-to-face class, there's a difference between a professor who walks in a well dressed, whatever that is. If I were to walk in a suit with a tie, clean shaven with short hair, that would be one perception of me. But when I show up with a beard and long hair and wearing jeans and t-shirt whatnot, it's a different sort of presentation. Now it's a conscious decision that I make, but mostly because I hate wearing ties. But we all make these decisions, right? In some ways, clothing is intended to persuade people that we fit into a certain mold or model or whatnot, or that we belong in a certain place. In other words, just look at rhetoric. Rhetoric is sort of the clothing for the argument. Now, in Backpacks versus Briefcases, Bolin Carroll starts with this idea that rhetoric is the way we use language and images to persuade, and it's what makes media work, right? We have 2-3 minutes before class starts or while we're waiting for the bus. We're going to check our phone and we're going to see what messages are out there. And a lot of it depends on how they're packaged, and creepy as it is, the computer now knows what I've been looking at on Google and will adjust the ads to that. So, for example, I've been looking at a new car. And so now every feed that I have when I look at the news shows me the type of cars that I've been looking at, which is creepy, but it's targeted at me. Bolin Carroll also says understanding rhetorical messages is essential to help us to become informed consumers, but it is also what helps us to evaluate the ethics of messages, how they affect us personally, and how they affect society. So, again, this is the overall purpose or import of this type of study, right? Not only how is ethic or these rhetorical devices being used upon us, but how can we use them upon others, as we talked about in previous videos when I talked about, sort of trying to convince my friend to go on a hike with me. Now, Bolin Carroll uses this rhetorical situation idea originated by Lloyd Blitzer to sort of look at one other way in which we can examine a text or you know piece of media. So he has a couple different terms. The first one is kind of confusing because it's not a word we're familiar with. So he calls it exigence. So exigence is the circumstance or conditions that invites reason, right? Imperfection marked by urgency is a defect, an obstacle, something waiting to be done, a thing which is other than it should be. So again, the way to think about it maybe is exigence is a problem, right? What is this piece responding to, right? Bolin Carroll says, what is the piece responding to, and what might have happened to make the person respond this way? So when we think about a piece and we think about hypocrisy of American slavery, or we think about JFK's inaugural speech, what was happening that made them respond to a situation in that way? What were the problems that they were trying to address? Now, at the same time that he's talking about exigence, Blitzer is also talking about audience, which is the intended or unintended recipient of the message, right? And interestingly, it's not just the audience, but an audience that should be able to help address the problem, right? Somebody that can actually affect change. An audience determines languages, formality, and medium of delivery. So maybe a good example again is to look at hypocrisy of American slavery and how Douglas is saying, we can fix this problem, you need to help fix this problem, and essentially gives a little bit of an idea of how we can set about that, or how they could set about that. And the last one is constraints, right? And so these are the things that constrain or restrict the actions needed to modify the situation. So they're the things that prevent us or box us in from maybe addressing this problem. Constraints can be beliefs, attitudes, documents, facts, traditions, images, interests, motives, according to Blitzer. So the example that Bolin Carroll uses on pages 50 to 51 of this is this example of an article titled, Why Some People Say Doe When You Say Homer. So the exigence there is the thing that the ad is responding to, right? So the ad is responding to the cutting of arts funding. The audience, who is it targeted to, should be relatively clear. Who's going to be most interested in that? Parents, right? There is a secondary audience, as pointed out in the article, which is people who might be able to donate money to the arts, so sort of philanthropists. And constraints might be the cost of the ad, where the ad can be placed, issues presented in the ad, and so on, right? And the last one is, interestingly, and we've talked about this a little bit, I believe, is the context in which a piece was presented, because we have to understand what was going on around the piece. So we can't just take the piece in a vacuum, right? I mean, I suppose we could, but if we want to analyze the rhetoric, we do have to know what was going on when JFK was elected that led him to say the things he did. What was happening in the world at the time that led Frederick Douglass to say what he did, right? And so on and so forth. So context is the influence which kind of gets to the exigence, if that makes sense. So, in order to analyze this, there are 7 things that Bolin Carroll recommends. To ask yourself, does the rhetoric address the problem it claims to address? Right? So, is there a clear problem that's being addressed? And does the piece actually explore that? Is the rhetoric targeted at an audience who has the power to make a change, right? So again, if it's kind of similar to the example that's used in Boyle and Carroll's piece, but if I complain to my wife about something that my boss did, that's fine, and it might be venting, but she doesn't have the power to make a change, right? If I have a problem with my boss, need to go talk to that person in order to effect change. Are the appeals appropriate to the audience? So in this case, we have to think, who are we appealing to and what is best, right? Again, this is kind of goes back to how we clothe the argument. Does the speaker give enough information to allow us to make an informed decision? So is there enough here for us to say, I've got the facts, the statistics, all the information I need in order to make my choice or decision? Does the rhetoric attempt to manipulate in any way by giving incomplete, inaccurate information or by abusing the audience's emotions? Now, this definitely happens. It's possible that I could be given false or misleading statistics, or that somebody could be falsely trying to convince me of something, or trying to appeal to my emotions in some way, right? What other subclaims do you have to accept or to understand the claim? So what little things do I have to agree to or understand in order to agree with the final claim? And what positive negative effects might come from this rhetoric? So let's bear that in mind for a moment, and let's look at a couple examples from antiquated media, things that we sort of know now were inaccurate or perhaps simply, well, silly to some extent. So the first ad here is one that maybe you've seen something like this before. And so we've got an ad here. We've got a gentleman here painting of a guy, and it says, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. So here the argument is, hey, this guy in the picture is a doctor. You can trust him. He works hard. He knows his stuff. He's always got time for you. And he's smoking Camels, right? So it must be the best choice. Now, does this provide enough information? Maybe, but not quite, right? Is it targeted at an audience that has the power to make a choice to go out and buy Camel cigarettes? Maybe. Hopefully, this was not in Teen Vogue, but in more a magazine with an audience that is more like educated adults of some sort, right? Does the rhetor, the speaker, give us enough information to make an informed decision? Again, maybe, maybe not. And do they attempt to manipulate things in any way? I think so. I think we're manipulating ethos a little bit here, right? We're manipulating the reader based on the credibility. Because this person is a doctor and because they smoke Camels, it must be okay or healthy is not a logical progression, right? Here's another. For a better start in life, start cola earlier. How soon is too soon? So here we've got an article that says, hey, you want your kid to be popular and avoid any awkwardness as a kid? Get them starting cola. Start drinking soda really early because that's going to help them. And more sugar, the better. Well, there's a couple things going on here again. We can think about what's the problem that it claims to address? Well, it claims to address this problem of kids being awkward or not fitting in. Is it addressed to a targeted audience? Well, this must clearly be addressed to parents, so it must be, in some sort of parenting magazine. Are the appeals appropriate to the audience? Well, I mean, it does have a kid. It is talking about health, so maybe somewhat appropriate to the audience, message aside. Do we have enough information to make an informed decision? Here's where it gets tricky and gets to that sort of inaccurate information. It does say that they've done laboratory tests. However, we don't know who did those laboratory tests, what the results were, how long they did them, how it was constructed. And it does say at the bottom there that it's, this ad is put out by the Soda Pop Board of America, which probably has a little bit of a bias, right? So when we think about these, we have to think about, again, context. This is obviously something that's outdated in our present day. We're very aware of the impact of sugar and caffeine on anybody, let alone small children, and how that can negatively affect them down the road. Okay, so moving back to um, this strategy, right? Of what problem does it solve, so on and so forth. What I want you to do is you can pause the video and look at this slide that's here. Take about 5 minutes. What problem does your selection address? So if that's JFK's inaugural speech, what problem is he addressing, or problems? It may be more than one. Can the audience do anything? Again, can Frederick Douglass's audience do anything about the problem of hypocrisy of slavery in America? And so on and so forth. And go ahead and answer all of those all the way down. And once you have in your notebook or whatever, go ahead and unpause the video and we'll continue on. Okay, so hopefully you've got down your answers to those and you've begun to think about it. And again, this is a way to broaden out and not just think like, well, I just need to say the author uses ethos, pathos, logos, or the author uses ethos in order to, right? Because there's far more to it, and the rhetorical triangle is only one method. Same with soapstone. Soapstone fills in some of the blanks, gets more at purpose. So remember that your task isn't necessarily to go down the line and say, here's ethos, here's logos, here's pathos, but to look at all of the strategies that could be used. Repetition, biblical allusion, word choice, establishment of credibility, personal narrative, stories, right? All of the things that we could do to convince somebody. So kind of in closing on this piece, before we turn to one last thing today, Bowling Carroll makes a really good point here about when she says that much of the reading and learning in college requires some level of rhetorical analysis. And I would actually even push that further. I think much of the reading and learning we do in life requires some level of rhetorical analysis. And so I think it's very important for us to understand what rhetorical devices are out there and how they're being used upon us. Right? So again, the sort of moral of the story here is that message is connected to context and purpose, and we sort of have to decide how to dress our message. Just in the same way, if we're looking at a piece of writing or a documentary or an ad, that we can think about, well, how did they dress up this message? What were the choices that they made, right? But also, finally, to be aware that others are doing the same thing. So the last thing that I want to do today, so that you have a little bit of a head start here, is to think about the thesis statement or working thesis statement for your rhetorical analysis. Now, a couple things here that you should bear in mind. A working thesis statement is just that. It's something that we can change or move, so you're not locked into it. Now, for rhetorical analysis, it is not a personal statement, so you shouldn't be using I believe that or I think that. So you should simply state the claim. You do need to make a claim that has to do with how the author has chosen these strategies and what they're using them for. And finally, you should really think about how well those strategies work. Are they effective? It's not necessarily true that you have to say that they're effective if they're ineffective. You can simply say this was ineffective. So here are 3 examples, and I'll put the quote or the link to these examples hopefully beneath the video if I remember. So 3 possible thesis statement examples for rhetorical analysis. Number 1, Jones effectively convinces his audience that blank through the use of statistics and surveys paired with emotional stories. If we look at that first one, do we know whether the reader or the author thinks Jones did this well or not? Yeah, the author says effectively convinces. Do we know what strategies this author is going to examine? Yes, statistics and surveys paired with emotional surveys, right? So those are the rhetorical strategies. Notice again, not ethos, pathos, or logos. The second one, although Myers includes many convincing logical arguments through the use of historical facts, her readers may doubt her objectivity because of her sarcastic tone. Again, we've got something here that includes, a little bit about, the strategies that the author was using. And we would expect that as evidence in the body paragraphs, we're going to need to see some examples of that sarcastic tone. We're also going to need to see some of those logical arguments. And the third and final one here, Thompson uses personal stories and tells of his extensive research in the area to make his readers believe in his credibility. These appeals to ethos, combined with his friendly tone, creates an effective argument for blank. Now here, the ethos part is okay because the previous sentence has indicated how Thompson has established ethos. His telling stories of his research in the area to make people believe his credibility. Okay, so I know that that's a lot and another long video. But if you have not yet read Backpacks versus Briefcases, I suggest you do. I also suggest that you go back and reread whichever piece you chose to really make sure that you've figured out how all of these pieces work together. All right, that's it for now. Email me with questions, concerns, or comments, and I'll talk to you soon.